There's a void where there should be ecstasy. Once you said you never cheat, but that's the act you always repeat. I find so hard to play. Every time it laughs in my face. You have no money because you never worked. On top of that, you treat me like dirt. I want you now. I don't need you now. I don't want you now. I don't need you now. I don't want you now. I don't need you now. Ooh, you're useless. I don't need you now. Never have you done a thing for me. I'm sick of you. I want to be free. Today's the day I cut you loose. I'm through taking all of you, baby. You treated me was a crime. No more wasting all my time. You're useless, riding through the car. I won't let you hurt me anymore. Useless. Oh, you're useless. I don't need you now. Baby, I don't want you now. I don't need you now. I don't want you now. I don't need you now. Gone are the days of my starry eyes. Reality has lifted your sky. No longer will I be your fool. This little girl that's gone to school and found your I don't need you now. Ooh, baby, oh, you I don't need you. Ooh, boy, you're useless. Oh, and no one else you reminds me of you. Yeah, useless. Oh, and like a dog without a bone, you ain't got no home. You're useless. No good, no good. Ooh, baby, I wanna tell you, you're
exciting and new. Come aboard, we're expecting you. And love, life's sweetest reward. Let it flow, it floats back to you. The love boat is something for everyone. Set a course for adventure, your mind on a new romance. And love won't hurt anymore. It's an open smile on a friendly shore.
There aren't any rules really, I guess. But I mean, people use rock and roll obviously as an excuse to dress up. I mean, it was a way of getting out of the house and feeling excited about yourself. And I think at the same time, it must have been a marvellous thing in the 50s to, I suppose, get involved in the whole idea of dressing up to mess up. And that was an act of hardcore rebellion that really was also a great way of announcing the sexuality, and clothes were really designed to look sexy in. I mean, the most extraordinary thing I think about the 50s is that's what you're getting at, the origin of rock and roll, dress and style and music. The most extraordinary thing from my point of view is that the styles of the girls' clothes in the 50s were styles that really originated at the turn of the century, in the days of the fin de siècle, or the naughty 90s, It was Belle Epoque, and the man who really designed those clothes had no idea of rock and roll and had no real genuine interest in it. He was a French designer called Christian Dior. And Christian Dior obviously had a few problems about his mother, and his mother was one of these real incredible conservative aristocratic women who obviously put him in the corner all the time and made him feel he was terribly ugly and she was fantastically beautiful, and influenced him obviously during the course of his life. And when he finally, at the age of 40, I think, embarked on a fashion career just after the war, World War II, when France was on its knees and the couturier business was something that America quickly, as its most firmest supporters, and certainly its most expensive and most lucrative supporters, closed the doors because they decided, I guess, after the war that they had no interest in this old European couturier fashion. They had just invented rock and roll. They'd invented the zip. They had practical clothing. Suddenly this whole idea of American practical clothing that was affixed to sports, was affixed to things to do with cowboys. It had nothing to do with this old-fashioned baroque and rather decadent air of the French couture houses. But the extraordinary point was that here, with all in the 40s, with all these very practical clothes and women becoming much more androgynous than ever before. Since the 20s, they'd thrown out the bras, they'd cut the dresses short, women had cut their hair short in the Eton crop, and you had all those wild 20s flapper girls in the Charleston. And this developed onward into the 40s, where you had these very severe looking women, you know, with these tight, tailored suits, wearing trousers, very similar to men's clothes. Against all that, this extraordinary, not very attractive man called Christian Dior suddenly decided to design his mother's clothes. And really what he did was he tended to be influenced by La Belle Epoque and brought back this whole grand look again. Pumped out thighs, huge petticoats, décolletage with girls wearing clothes which revealed their whole top, just like these Victorian women who sat at home waiting for Papa to come back and never moved, corseted like crazy, and with waists, that I think they even took certain bones out of their bodies and had special operations to acquire a 16 or 17 inch waist. This look, this hourglass shape, became something that Dior brought back at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. It was a look that staggered everybody in America and staggered everybody across Europe because it was so old-fashioned. Dresses fell down to the ankle. There was tons and tons of material, voluminous skirts. People sewing brassieres back into dresses. Things that they'd thrown out in 1920 were now being fitted back in 1950. Well, who is to consider this kind of look that was so antiquated, so restrictive, so conservative, so much of the Victorian age, was to come back in 1950 and be coined by an American journalist, the new look. This man saved basically France from falling on its knees and becoming an old decadent couturier business, brought it all back, and people are still living on it today. He basically turned the French fashions into an amazing mega empire again. And unknown to anyone else, across the high streets of the world, his dresses, which were basically representations of his mother's Belle Epoque, with all these voluminous petticoats underneath, with these little cinched waists, with these bras that girls of 16 were filling up with Kleenex tissues inside their dresses, were just figments of Christian Dior's aristocratic, conservative bourgeois mother, wearing La Belle Epoque. And here they were, all across America, dancing with James Deans. Luckily, for all of us perhaps, Christian Dior didn't design men's clothes, only women's. So here he had icons of his mother all across America, all across the world, dancing to rock and roll, these Belle Epoque look. No one would, how? Why should someone be wearing all these vast petticoats, sewing bras in, things that they destroyed 40 years ago? Here they were in what was a subversive act, this jungle music that people called about. Here was women in La Belle Epoque costumes, dancing to James Dean. That's the most extraordinary fact in rock and roll style ever, because no one would ever have believed, if you dreamt it in your wildest dreams, that such a thing could ever happen. Not how, why, there's no real answer to it. But that became rock and roll style, and is still today. I mean, God, Cyndi Lauper is another figure.
Now, move on to something related to that.
Yeah.
Question I have is, Connie Francis and that Charles Ridley, they dressed girls, like you're describing.
Yeah.
And you think it was an outgrowth? I mean, as you described, was it a sign of the times, or was it?
At those times, if I remember rightly, my source material, because I was a fashion student for years, and I come from a world of fashion, and though I became a painter, I was still totally wrapped up in the world of fashion, and I read a lot of source material, and I remember reading cuttings, press cuttings, where women in Paris, literally, and I think this has never ever happened before in fashion, if they ever saw a woman wearing a Dior or a Dior type skirt, they would savage her, brutalize her, and literally rip her clothes off her back. Now, there was no other fashion or fashion designer that's ever happened to. I remember the days when Dior was a shy, portly, unglamorous man, nothing that you would actually attach as an image to these glamorous frocks that Ava Gardner was flying in to buy at thousands of dollars, and Elizabeth Taylor and Vivian Leigh and all of them from Hollywood. Because this was glamour being brought back. Women became these hourglass shapes. Jane Mansfield, Marilyn Monroe, the icons of rock and roll 50s style. Hollywood wanted it. They didn't want this severe look. It brought all this terrific glamour, technicolor. This whole look was so 50s and so rock and roll. And the most extraordinary thing, Christian Dior held his fashion shows in silence. Never had any music, wasn't interested, didn't know what rock and roll was. However, getting back to your point, what I was saying is that even in New York, women were holding placards when Dior arrived at Bergdorf Goodman's to give a lecture and to sign autographs as a public appearance for these new clothes. Women were outside with huge placards that said, Monsieur Dior, we abhor dresses to the floor. and that was the real rebellion. People hated it because it went against everything to do with feminine liberation. It was constricting. It was putting women back in a corset. It was making women sexuality suddenly centered and sold and very pro-oriented. But no rock and roll girl cared about that. For them, it was, they used it in a different way. You see, they took that style, wanted to put it on the high street, throw it into the prom balls, fuck around or whatever it was, mess around in the clubs that existed, get out on the street. It was a way of announcing their sexuality in the most provocative way. They didn't want to not show their breasts. They wanted to actually push them out. They wanted to be very sculptural. They wanted to be this Teutonic, blonde-haired, lunatic, Aryan, cosmetic, sexual device. Right? They wanted to be it, so they used it all. And all those petticoats, well, it looked so mysterious if you would fondle and, you know, and precariously kind of deal with your hands underneath the dresses. I mean, it was just more interesting. Today it's just a wraparound skirt. It's not as mysterious. It was all these things they all added, and of course the cinch waist gave everybody this very sexual shape. Well, it was a lovely contrast to the guys, because the guys, I suppose, dug out what was very black, what was only existing in the ghettos, and I think Elvis Presley was one of the first to do that. His hair was red, but he dyed it black. Why? Because he hung out downtown parts of Memphis, where only black guys were hanging around. And what did they sell in those black little shops? Big pink jackets, wide shoulders, this whole incredible peacock-like look that was flash and went perfect to the beat. Why? Because he emulated these black performers, I guess, who travelled around in little circus acts, playing blues, rhythm and blues, all sorts of music that he finally got inspired by and harnessed. And I suppose it was the first white man to dress up and dance and sing like a black man. and he became an outrageous phenomenon which everybody wanted to emulate because he was the jungle spirit. He had that true pagan rock and roll anarchic quality, and what a better marriage you could have than a figure that looked like that dancing with a girl that was basically this perversion of Dior's mother all across the world. That was his style.
Is that why you think these teenage guys imitated Elvis Presley?
Oh, I think that the reason to imitate Elvis Presley is because he looked, again, a wonderful sexual device. That was the whole thing. That heavy, shiny, black hair. I mean, if you had like hair like mine in those days, it would be ridiculous. You'd be thinking of Bozo the Clown, right? But I mean, if it was all slicked back and shiny and black, it was very sexual, that whole feeling. The fact that you could grow your sideburns down a bit was very tough and sexual and very macho. The fact that your shoulders were accentuated 3 inches on either side gave you a very big and masculine and tough look. The fact that the clothes were bright took you outside of the bank manager's office. No one could ever know that you would work in a bank or you would work in some office. No, how could you? Not with a jacket like that. You were like a traffic light, and you stopped people in their tracks. And that announcement was like the announcement of your whole sexuality. It was a demonstration of your sexual prowess. And rock and roll was a wonderful excuse and a marvelous aid for kids to do that and create this, what became known, I suppose, in the 50s as the generation gap and the voice of the teenager.
Now, what about, if Presley was inspired by the Blacks in the 50s, what about Little Richard or Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, their zoot suit looks?
Yeah, well, they obviously didn't have to be inspired by anybody. They were, you know, for all intents and purposes, I guess the kings of rock and roll. They really, you know, Chuck Berry, you know, I mean, gave the whole of the rock and roll world those 3 chords and that classic songs of Johnny B. Good and School Days and Maybelline and Nadine and I mean, and the walk, and he was rock and roll, and all you had to do was just remember some of it that seemed to stick out in those rock and roll movies or capture it on the sleeve of a record to imitate it. And of course, you know, every group literally in England finally did in the 60s.
What back in the 50s, do you think anyone else who imitated the Blacks as well as Presley did?
I think that there wasn't anybody really quite as sexually potent. It was his look. I guess, you know, his face was like this incredible sex, you know, just filled with sex. I mean, if you looked at Jerry Lee Lewis, he was a killer, a master pianist, obviously a musician way over and above Presley's talent. Presley's talent was more in his sexuality, his look, and his singing. Jerry Lee Lewis didn't quite have that together. He was much more southern. He wasn't so black inspired. He was a different kind of act. Carl Perkins was a different kind of act. People didn't realise or quite catch on to that sexuality. When that sexuality, when a white guy was beginning to look like a black guy singing black songs, it was that melting pot and that kind of sauce that was dynamite. And I don't think they were so aware of it. You know, it's always this whole thing. In retrospect, you can see how it works. You never write manifestos before the action. Manifestos are always written after the action, and he was the action. 5 years later, everybody was looking around and saying, gee, how can we create another Presley? We've now got the model. He was the model. He was the frame. He was the point of reference. You had Gene Vincent, you had Eddie Cochran, who came a little later and was a child prodigy guitarist and looked wonderful. You had Johnny Burnett and his rock and roll trio, you had Roy Orbison, you had Jerry, you had Carl Perkins, you had lots and lots of guys, and in the 60s you had your Fabians and your Frankie Avalons and so on. And they all looked versions of, but they never were quite right. They never had quite the desperation either. I think the big thing with Elvis was he looked desperate always. He looked lean and he looked hungry. And that, you know, perpetrated an energy in his style that was devastating. When he went into the army, of course, came out as the All-American Boy and they painted up the record covers with bright rosy cheeks, and he was different. He wasn't quite the same. He never really captured again that tremendous hungry sexuality that you knew was coming out of those cotton fields and deep white, southern, poor families. And that was something that I think probably in England and in New York and everywhere, something that people didn't really even know about then. They didn't travel as much. I mean, today everybody knows about everything tomorrow, you know. What's happening in England, you'll know in Sydney, and what's happening in Sydney, you'll know in New York. The communication gap, you know, everything was a lot more mysterious. No one really knew Will. No one even knew he died instead. The fact that he did was just extraordinary at the time, if you think about it. No one knew. Who knows if he had red hair? That's amazing. He didn't. But that's it. All those things helped a great deal, and I think that finally he really did become that funny model. And I can't think of any other singer at the time. In terms of girls, though, I'm not sure there. I think girls weren't into girl singers. I think girls were just into getting the guy, and they just wanted the style. I think, you know, I don't think girls went screaming and trying to imitate Brenda Lee or Connie Francis, who was just some Jewish American princess. It was ridiculous at times. And the girls did not have the politics. They didn't really have that edge. They didn't really have a sense of change about them. They weren't as desperate looking. They didn't look rock and roll. I mean, I try to think of it. What was the hardcore, like Wanda Jackson?
What do you think would happen? What do you think would happen if a girl had tried to look like Elvis Presley and she tried to be tougher here in the U.S.?
If she tried to look like Elvis Presley, I think the world would have severely changed. I think that we would not be living in times where I think the androgynous quality in that respect, when a girl had to be tough, I just think the world would be very different. I think if that had happened then, the world would have been a lot more radical than it is today. And rock and roll would have probably been ultimately a more useful tool for kids to express themselves with than it's come today, which is more like a business. It's just developed into a major corporate business, like most other mediums of expression. I think that what you're saying there was just too sophisticated an idea at the time. Girls just wanted to be girls, and they wanted to look like girls, and they wanted to look extreme versions of sexual devices. That's what Dior gave the world, right? At La Belle Époque at that time. No one can determine why at that time it was needed and used in the way it was, but it was. And girls were girls and boys were boys. I think in the 40s, boys looked more like girls and girls looked more like boys. And you probably go back and you'll see far more androgynous strains. And it's extraordinary now, when you bring it right into the 80s, how this androgynous quality seems so unique. But it wasn't really. It's only unique in comparison to the extremities of sexual role models that you had in the 50s.
Let's stop right here right now.